Welcome, gentle reader. We're so happy to have you again in this episode of Everything is Everything. We're up bright and cheery in the early morning just for you, building one more episode. Yon Amit has a hungry look. Such men are dangerous. Amit, what dangerous ideas do you have to offer us?
So it's not so much a dangerous idea, but it's an interesting idea which I hadn't thought about before. Now it struck me, this idea, the thought that I'm going to share struck me while I was researching for my episode with the great economist Land Pritchett, released on the Seen and the Unseen a few days ago. And he's just such a great man that no amount of time would have done it justice, but I did my best. But while researching for that, I sort of came across a strand of thinking which is not something I think he explicitly stated, but when I was looking at the history of how states evolved and cities evolved, the thought struck me that actually, when we think about city governments, we think that there is a nation state that has a government and then they give power to various units under them, and that's a city government right there. But actually, city governments and nation state governments evolved in a very different way. A nation state evolved in a very top down coercive kind of way, where the idea is that you form a nation state, your immediate priority as a state is number one, you need tax revenues to govern, so you take that, and number two, you need conscription for the army because you're always fighting wars back in the old days. So it's basically people and their money, and that's a whole thing, and you don't actually have to do anything in return beyond the point. Whereas if you look at city states, city governments, they evolved in a bottom up kind of way. We live together in a particular place. If the two of us are living together, it's not a big deal. Our family is not a big deal. But once you go beyond a certain size, there is an organic need for order. There is an organic need for perhaps rule of law or basic services. And that's how the city state comes into being. So it is by its nature much more responsive, much more nimble, and these are separate sort of evolutions. And what we have kind of landed up in India with is essentially just the larger coercive superstructure of the nation state, with no concept of what a truly responsive government is, because we've never been allowed to evolve from the bottom up in modern times, you know. And I think that frame made me think, look at things differently, look at, in fact, federalism differently as well.
We in India are too used to thinking of a centralization worldview, that there is New Delhi and the power is concentrated in New Delhi. And this, reflects the empires of old. It reflects the way the British behaved, and we've carried forward too much of that package. And of great importance in the journey of India is to rethink this and find a different intellectual package on how to think about the Indian state and how to think about decentralization.
And the interesting thing to note is that in our history, not so long ago, we actually had empowered mayors. Like C. Rajgopalachari was effectively mayor of Salem in 1917, chairman of the municipal board. Jawaharlal Nehru had a similar position in Allahabad in 1923. Chittaranjan Das had that position in Calcutta. Then Subhash Chandra Bose had that. Sardar Patel was prominent in the Allahabad Municipal Council. So those local governments were actually, under the British Empire, were actually more empowered to do a lot of local tasks which the colonial government simply couldn't be bothered with. And it worked out well, and it also served as a training ground for these future leaders in governance. So it is not exactly true that all of these great leaders, some of whom, were actually our prime minister and home minister when we got independence, that they just went from being activists to politicians. It wasn't like that at all. They knew governance, they cared deeply about it, they understood public finance. That's a crucible out of which they emerged. And for some reason, while we took most of the colonial coercive superstructure, we lost that little part of the puzzle. So Ajay, let's start by laying the ground. As the title of the episode indicates, we want to talk about decentralization, and it's important today. Everyone keeps paying lip service to it, and the remarkable thing is, if there is any place in the world that needs decentralization, it is really India. So explain why.
The thing to focus on is heterogeneity. In the vast 3.3 million square kilometers of India, there is remarkable levels of heterogeneity. The the obvious things we know, the languages are different, the cultures are different, the food habits are different. That is very well known and very obvious. There is equally a great level of heterogeneity in economics. I like to use the CMIE household survey data. They have divided India into about 100 regions. So each homogeneous region is about 7 districts. And I find it interesting to think of what is the gap between the rank 1 homogeneous region and the rank 102 homogeneous region by a variety of measures, and how far apart are they. And the quick summary is that in the case of income, the average income of the richest to the poorest homogeneous region is a ratio of about 5. Okay, so the poorest places are about 5x worse than the richest places. But when you go to other measures, the levels of heterogeneity are even higher. One measure I like to focus on is women and mobile phones, okay, or young women and mobile phones. Okay, so this is a combination of economics, that the household has to be prosperous enough to uh, be thinking of a mobile phone for women in the household and young women in the household. But also it has to do with social progressivity. Um, Many times a male conception of control would create a bias where the men folk might not like to have a woman who has a mobile phone, who then achieves greater autonomy and freedom. On these measures, the top to the bottom is like 10x apart, 15x apart, depending on the age bracket that you take. So just think that the mobile phone ownership of the best places is like 90%, 95%, and the worst places are like 5%, 10%, 15%. So there is a vast gap between these regions, and that's something that we have to confront, and it requires a different way of thinking compared to our common behavior. You mentioned Lant Pritchett. Many years ago, Lant said to me that by some measures he was playing with, the ratio of the richest place in Latin America divided by the poorest place in Africa is the kind of number that you get with the richest place in India divided by the poorest place in India. India is that diverse and that heterogeneous. And it really becomes a first order issue to think about on all questions about policy and state and actually everything. So you remember we did a episode on imperial versus adaptive firms. And actually this is the intuition driving that. If you are in a relatively homogeneous country, then more or less one design of the firm would go through. You have one package of products and processes, and you more or less covered the whole Germany. But when you have a diverse country like India, the design of the firm needs to change to reflect that. And firms need to build into themselves the information and incentives that will cope with the crazy level of diversity of India.
So I want to come at that from two different angles. But first, an aside, that I love that metric about how many women own mobile phones. A few years back, I did an episode of The Seen and the Unseen with Devika Khe, Nidhi Gupta, and Hamsini Hariharan called Metrics of Empowerment, where we sat down together and tried to discuss that what are the unconventional metrics by which we can talk about whether women in India are more empowered or not. Like my starting metric for that, and I wrote a controversial column on it more than a decade ago. I think that column had the headline, "We should celebrate rising divorce rates." Because my point was that rising divorce rates means more women are getting empowered and have the agency and perhaps the independence to walk away from bad marriages. So I thought, so other people will bemoan it and say, oh, we are getting like the West. I thought that is a phenomenal indicator and we need more of that. And these three women, like phenomenal thinkers, all of them came up with a whole bunch of interesting ones. One I remember off the top of my head was that who orders the groceries in the house? Is it the man or the woman? Right? So there are really interesting sort of areas that you can look at there. Now, I want to sort of underscore what you said in two ways. One is to talk about that disparity. I want to also look at some conventional metrics and mention these disparities. Now, the next two figures I got from Neelakanthan RS's book, North versus South. He's run an episode of The Seen and the Unseen with me. Disparity one, life expectancy, right? So Kerala has a life expectancy of 75. which is really high, which is essentially like Argentina and Thailand. It's pretty good. Whereas UP has a life expectancy of 11 years less, 64 years old. 64 years is, and that's what you would expect from Liberia, Ethiopia, and Haiti. Right, so you have Argentina, Thailand on the one hand, and Liberia and Ethiopia on the other hand, 75 and 65. The other figure is infant mortality rates, which is truly startling, where India's best performing state in that regard is Kerala with an infant mortality rate of 7 kids per thousand. And the lower the better, obviously, for my gentle readers who may not know what this number is. So Kerala is 7, the USA is 6. Right, so Kerala is that good. Tamil Nadu is second at 15. You have a bunch of middling states like Punjab, Maharashtra, 1920. Madhya Pradesh is 48. Right, so you have Kerala at 7 and you have Madhya Pradesh at 48, which just completely blows my mind. The other dimension at which I want to come to is something that I first learnt about in the third or fourth episodes I recorded with our mutual friend Karthik Muralidharan, and I'm sure he has his data in his book as well, which is just out. And it's about the size of the Indian states. We take it for granted. We don't realize how freaking big they are, right? So has 15 of the 15 biggest Indian states would all be among the world's top 42 countries by population, right? Uttar Pradesh, Ajay, Uttar Pradesh, and this I calculated myself, so forgive me if I'm wrong by 100,000 or so. Uttar Pradesh is the size of France, Germany, Italy, and Spain combined, right? It is that big. Karthik points out that, you spoke of 100 homogeneous regions. Karthik just looks at the 700 districts and he points out that the average district is bigger than 85 countries in the world today. So that is a governance challenge which you face, and those 85 countries hopefully would all say we demand democracy. A district actually cannot have democracy by definition because everything is so centralized. And the governance challenge is mind blowing. It's what Uttar Pradesh is as that blows my mind. France, Germany, Spain, Italy combined. And I was saying, oh, one state government, and will do it. It is a mind blowing challenge. And so no wonder so many things go wrong. So, these are incredible figures. So, Ajay, I have a question for you, therefore. We've established the heterogeneity, we've established the diversity, and we've established the freaking incredible size. How do we think about governance in this regard? What are the implications? How do we, think of the role of the state? What should be done at a central level, state level, city level?
There are two questions that change quite a bit when you grapple with this level of heterogeneity and you take this heterogeneity seriously. The first question is, what should the state do? What are the problems? What are the public goods where you might like to use state power? And then these answers will vary greatly depending on where you are. So if you are in North India, maybe air quality is a very big deal. If you are in Kerala, maybe climate change and the rising waters and the new phenomenon of Arabian Sea cyclones, which are tearing away at the coastline, that's a big problem. So, different places are different and they each have their own problems. So that's the first idea, that what are the questions where a public goods response is called for will vary depending on where you are. The second line of attack is how you might choose to do something would vary greatly based on where you are, because the government is supposed to produce some public goods and get some things done. But the management details, the mechanics about how that will be done should vary greatly based on the local conditions. So what technologies can be used, what organization designs would be appropriate. Right away, I want to open up a great black box, which is wages. Okay, we have a mad idea in India that all civil servants in India essentially paid the same. Now, what sense does this make? This is a widely heterogeneous country. The wages should reflect local conditions. A civil servant in Bombay should get paid more than a civil servant living in Calcutta. Don't you think, Amit, that reflecting the poverty of Calcutta, we should be doing things differently?
No, absolutely. But I agree about Bombay and Calcutta, but civil servants, we don't need so many civil servants, but
Yeah,
continue.
but the entire design of the state is distorted in India because we insist on one big flattening sound. all civil servants everywhere in India will get paid the same. And that just doesn't sit well with this very high levels of heterogeneity. So in the rich parts of India, the civil servants are paid a little too little, and in the poor parts of India, the civil servants are paid too much, and that just generates so much distortion. Um, there are many practical problems, for example, in public health, where solutions are local. So my favorite obsession around public health is mosquitoes. And it comes as a surprise to most people in India that actually mosquitoes can be controlled. And purposive state action can actually make a huge difference to mosquito control. And this is something that we in India have given up on. Like, we're so gloomy about the failures of the Indian state, and we just think that okay, people will get malaria, we'll try to put them into hospitals. But you can't do anything about the mosquitoes. This is not true. Like, there is actually a great public health journey in how to control mosquitoes. But the thing is that the characteristics of the mosquitoes, they change every 100, 200 kilometers. So in every place in the world, mosquitoes are a highly local phenomenon. They respond to natural selection and reflect local weather conditions and the behavior of their victims and so on. So how will you construct a mosquito control program will once again be local. It will vary by neighborhood. And that's why you need local control, that local people should be solving that local problem. That is malaria problem. Maybe in Ladakh it is not. Maybe you don't have mosquitoes in Ladakh. And given that you have mosquitoes, how might you control the mosquitoes? The mechanisms would vary by locale.
So Mosquitoes in Ladakh would be an incredible title for a rock album, a heavy metal album, in fact. But so I'll kind of add to that with what to me is the most clear and startling example of that disparity. Again, I got this particular one from Nilakanthan, where he pointed out that Kerala has a problem of diabetes and obesity, right? And in the heartland, you have problems of malnutrition and stunting. Right now, the policy responses to both of them are completely different. In the heartland, it should be figure out a way to increase calories and then the quality of calories. Whereas for Kerala, it's something completely different because they don't have that problem. But when you have a centrally directed response and a centrally, directed policy for all of these places, then you're going completely wrong. And people in Kerala are like, WTF, this is not our problem. And the other interesting factoid here is something that I learned from Karthik again, from his book, and it's mentioned, we speak about it in our latest episode, which is that 3% of India's budget is spent at the local level. And in China, which we think of as so centralized, 50% is spent at the local level. So China is 17 times more decentralized than India. 50% of their budget is at the local level, and their local authorities typically are incredibly empowered to do a lot of stuff. And here it is 3%. So just there is this disparity in needs, diabetes versus malnutrition, and there is a disparity in the autonomy that you get via the budgets being in your control.
And as I was saying, disparity in the local capabilities and the local mechanisms. I want to tell two stories around Kerala. At the time of the pandemic, Kerala had a head start. There were Malayali students studying in China, and they came back home and they brought back COVID. So Kerala actually was grappling with the first surge of COVID before almost anybody else in India. And Kerala has significant capabilities in their health system. So they were up and running, figuring out quarantines and isolation and a bag of techniques on how to deal with the early stages of COVID. And for some time, the union government tried to do absolutely nothing. And then the union government started announcing these complete lockdowns that were going to apply across the entire country, and so on. All through that period, there was a very legitimate pushback from Kerala health authorities saying, like, hang on, we know what we are doing, we know what to do. Don't tell us what to do. We are probably 3 steps ahead of you. Talking back to the union, we are probably 3 steps ahead of you in terms of figuring this thing out and knowing what to do. And it was a very vivid example where there was capability in parts of India, and it made no sense for New Delhi to instruct everybody on what is to be done. And I have a favorite anecdote, which is about the time when Susan Thomas was bitten by a dog. Okay, so Susan was bitten by a dog, and a series of wonderful things happened. Okay, the
Starting with the biting.
well, the biting. Susan will always apologize that it was her fault.
Oh,
So the dog bit her, and she says, I was troubling the dog. So, I mean, it is fair that the dog bit me. Susan has like very high standards for good behavior. So, the story starts at Susan irritating the dog, and the dog bit her. So, here's the list of surprises. So, surprise number one, the family members took her to a government clinic. Okay, so now in most parts of India, people like us would not do that. People like us would go to a private establishment. In Kerala, there was no friction. It was considered the obvious thing to do that, yeah, you'll go to a government clinic. Okay, and then surprise number two, the doctor at the government clinic was there. The facility was not vacant, and he was smart and competent and sensible. So he asked the correct questions. He said, is it a family dog? Yes, it is a family dog. Is the dog around at home and is he fine? Yes, he is fine. Will the dog be under observation? Yes, he will be under observation. Okay, if so, I'll give you a little bit of antiseptic and you go home. And why is that? Because if the dog has rabies, the dog will collapse and go crazy first. And at that time, we start the rabies vaccinations for the human. Okay, now this is the correct diagnostic pathway. These are the correct set of questions, and this is the correct conclusion. Now, most doctors in India, private or public, would respond to a dog bite by saying, we will blast rabies vaccination. And this was such a nice experience where the person did the right thing. Now, this is a civil servant in Kerala doing all these things. In the rest of India, in most states, this is unimaginable. Starting with, the family would not think to take a person to a government facility. The government facility will most likely be vacant, or there will be a low quality hack who will not know his or her way, and they will just blast 9 injections without little bit of knowledge and care about what is rabies. So this is again a story that reminds us about the immense diversity of India, and then you should not have a one size fits all. That what you think about state has to vary with that. That I may be radical in my views on the health system, but I respect what Kerala has in a government run health system. And most of India, the government run healthcare system is horrible, and you really want to do radical changes there. But in Kerala, we respect the capabilities that they have.
and perhaps a subject for another day, but the excellent governance culture in Kerala actually predates independence, and it goes back, decades, if not centuries. So it's not just something that, post-independence phenomenon, but it kind of predates that, and that's interesting. And an aside, not related to cities or decentralization, but you mentioned that doctor and the excellent treatment that he gave, that I have done an episode of the Seen and the Unseen with our mutual friend Lancelot Pinto, who is one of the great doctors in this country. And part of it was about how do you treat COVID, and his funda, and he treated me when I got COVID twice, and his funda was that do not over medicate. A lot of the deaths were happening because of over medication, and patients would be demanding, they would say कि मेरे neighbor को ivermectin दिया, ये दिया, वो दिया, मुझे भी चाहिए. And the over medication would cause their immune system to overreact, and a week later they'd be gone because of that, not because of COVID, right? And this was happening. And Lancelot to me was, boss, Amit, just start with a paracetamol, right? And you take it step by step. And I never had to take anything other than paracetamol and cough syrup. And of course, I was lucky it wasn't so severe, but it was a structured approach and not play by the book, which is especially courageous, because playing by the book is a safe thing to do. Even patients you treat correctly, random things will happen and they could pop off, and then they'll blame you कि आपने दवाई नहीं दिया. So, just a delightful aside. So, Ajay, my question to you is that how do we learn from history, in the sense that there are other large countries like the USA, like the European Union, it's not a country, but it's, face many of these challenges, have also dealt with, heterogeneity, and also are deeply federalist in nature. In fact, for the USA, it is as much a part of the DNA as a respect for individual freedom is. It's quite beautiful. So how do we use those lessons, and how do we think about our challenge? Because I don't think there is any challenge at this scale when you consider the crazy heterogeneity and the sizes involved.
Uh, these debates have actually taken place all over the world. So this problem of a highly heterogeneous India is not new, and it has been dealt elsewhere. And the main answer is through more decentralization. And there is a sweet term which is used, which is a federalist approach. The federalism and a federalist approach is what works better, and you basically devolve power down. You said the European Union is not a country. It's actually a very conscious set of design choices around these kinds of questions, where the idea is that in the European Union, you will bring together certain things that should be done at a Europe scale, and you will decentralize others where there is a legitimate case for local preferences. So personal law in Portugal, in Spain, it reflects more of Catholic religious thinking, whereas personal law in Northern Europe are more like atheistic, modern, secular people. And so they respect that heterogeneity within the country, within the countries, and each country goes its own way while having many common structures. And remember, for example, they have the European Central Bank, which is a common currency, the euro, not exactly the same as the European Union, but still that is an example of where something is brought together because it makes sense to bring it together. Similarly, the problem of national defense has been brought together into NATO, and you don't have to have the same solution for everything. So we will go by each issue, and that is actually the design philosophy that we will apply. While I'm on this subject, I cannot resist talking about tanks.
You can never resist talking about tanks. Fine, Ajay Shah, one more time, let's talk about tanks.
So in Netherlands, at some point they were buying German tanks. Okay, so after the Second World War, they said that, okay, fine, we forgive you. You know, we know you invaded us a couple of times, but we'll let it go. And they got back to buying German tanks. So they were a member of NATO, and little country, like 20 tanks or whatever, small little army, but like honestly, they would pay money to the Germans, and they would buy the German tanks, and they had their own tanks. Then it started becoming a little silly that, you know, this is really subscale. I mean, tanks require a logistic tail and maintenance and all kinds of management complexities. So they started saying to the Germans that, you know what, we'll pay for the tanks, but the tanks will be controlled by the German army on our behalf, and there will be our soldiers who will go into that. So the tanks belonging to the government are then integrated under the force command of Germany, and there are soldiers from here that become part of those units, but those units are fully integrated into the German army. Okay, these kinds of arrangements have taken place all over Europe. So the European Union is a pragmatic, sensible approach that don't draw lines on maps and then start defining the state by lines on maps. Instead, for each question, monetary policy, ECB, you have one currency, the euro, and you don't need 40 currencies. Managing a battalion of tanks, okay, at battalion strength, it really doesn't make too much sense to have your own entire fixed cost of tanks. Okay, fine, we'll just fuse this into the German army. That is the dream of the European Union. So it's far more clever than meets the eye. Yes, it is not a country, and they'll say that's by design.
A brief interruption that I have a vision of a thumbnail now, and the thumbnail has Ajay Shah looking out of a tank with the, with the headline beside. So let's see if we can put it into motion. Continue.
Yeah. So all over the world, these questions have been debated, and the broad idea is more decentralization. Uh, there is a phrase in this field which has been appropriated by the economists, okay, and this phrase is called the subsidiarity principle. So I want to first talk about the phrase, and I want to go back a little into the history of the phrase. So the subsidiarity principle is a simple idea. It says that every function of government should be placed at the lowest level at which it can be done. So can you do monetary policy at the village level? No, it would be a mess. Can you do monetary policy at the level of each country of the European Union? No, it's been done before, and it's very painful. Every time you cross a border, like between Maharashtra and Gujarat, you'd have to change currency, which makes no sense. Okay, so for a problem like the currency, it really makes sense to do it at the highest level. Therefore, it should be placed at the highest level. But can you do mosquito control at the village level? Answer is yes. Very well, then we'll do it at the village level. Can you do mosquito control at the city level? Yes, then do it at the city level. Okay, so the subsidiarity principle is start at the bottom and try to do it at the lowest level, and only when that fails, go to higher levels. And this is a simple design principle, which is like saying decentralization first, that above all we will be decentralized. We will be centralized for a few things where decentralization is really not feasible. The subsidiarity principle has been stolen by the economists, and we economists parrot it around claiming it as ours, but it actually goes back to something older, one of the world's most successful organizations. Okay, and one of the world's most successful organizations is the Catholic Church. Okay, so from around 300 AD to about 1950, the Catholic Church was an important organization in the world. They had a huge impact on the world. At their peak, the Vatican controlled armies and participated in international treaties, and they were a very important organization, and they lived for a very long time. They lived longer than most empires. Okay, and there's a thought there that empires tended to crash partly because empires did more centralizing. And one of the design secrets of the Catholic Church was decentralization, that subsidiarity principle. There were churches all over the world, and they had their own autonomy, and there was the absolutely minimum level of central control, and that's actually what worked well for them. And as I said, all the way till 1950, the Catholic Church was an important institution. Okay, now it's gone. I mean, as part of the secularization of the world, uh, the religiosity of most advanced countries has basically just collapsed. Now there are countries like China that are going into the Christian religion, so maybe some forms of church will become important again. But you just think of the time span from about 300 AD to about 1950. That's a very long time period. And the secret sauce was subsidiarity principle.
I love the story, and I'm going to tell you another story which is unrelated to everything. Please forgive me, gentle listeners, but the story came into my head. But you mentioned the Catholic Church, and this came into my head, and I'll tell you why after this. So, this is a story told to me by Vasant. Again, our mutual friend. I produce a great podcast for him called Brave New World, so check that out. Linked from the show notes. So, Vasant has a friend called Bubba, right? So, one day, Vasant is hanging with Bubba, and Bubba tells him, I know everybody in the world. So Vasant says, what nonsense, man? You can't know everybody in the world. So Bubba says, no, I know everyone in the world. So Vasant tells Bubba, okay, prove it to me. We are in New York, right? So let's go over to Trump Towers and see if Donald Trump recognizes you. So they drive over to Trump Tower, and he hits the intercom thing, and the video thing comes, and Trump's secretary says, "Oh, Mr. Baba, it's you. Donald will be so happy to see you." And then he's led in, and they have a nice meal and all that. So Baba knows Donald Trump. So he says, "Okay, fine, Trump and all that, but Biden is our president. Do you know Joe Biden?" So Baba says, "Come with me." So Vasant and Baba go to the White House, and then they're at the gate, and the guard says, "All right, what do you want?" But from a distance, from his Oval Office, which I don't know if it has a window looking out, but let's assume it does. Joe Biden sees Baba, and he says, "Baba, Baba," and then he, runs out to greet Baba, falls down a couple of times. His people pick him up, but he comes and greets Baba. So at this point, Vasant asks Baba that fine, these are two Americans and like whatever, but you can't know the Pope. So Baba says, come with me. So they go to the Vatican City and all of that. And this is one of those things where one of those festivals where a crowd is congregated, like hundreds of thousands of people waiting to see the Pope make an appearance on the balcony. And there is jostling and all that as Vasant and Baba try to get to the front. And at one point, Vasant slips a little bit, and when he looks up, Baba is nowhere to be seen. So he's like, where is Baba? Where is Baba? And then he looks up at the thing, and the Pope comes out, and then Baba comes out with the Pope. And Vasant is like, what the fuck is going on? And then the guy next to Vasant taps Vasant on the shoulder and says, excuse me, who's that guy with Baba? So this is sort of my digressive story. But my follow-up question is this: that at the start of the episode we discussed how city-states evolved, bottom-up, responsive, etc., etc. How nation-states evolved, top-down, coercive. And my question here is, how, in your view, should we think of states and villages? Because a state seems to me to be like a subsidiary of the central government, and full of limitations. And a village is interesting, like Baba Sahib Ambedkar famously said and correctly said about, it was correct at the time and to some extent still is. He said, what is a village but a sink of localism, a den of ignorance and narrow mindedness? And this was his argument for centralizing power in the state. That, our villages are full of social evils like caste and the way women are treated and all of that. They cannot be trusted to govern themselves in the way that, modern liberals would like. Let's centralize power. Now, that centralizing power was really over centralizing to a massive extent, understandable, but in retrospect, didn't really work out. So, this is something that confuses me a little bit. That if the idea is let's go as local as possible, that should be to the level of a village. But the problem Ambedkar points out, and what role do states play in this? When T20 cricket became popular, people said Test cricket rahega, T20 rahega. We don't need ODIs anymore. So I think states are kind of like ODIs. But so give me your view on all of these.
So it is indeed the case that the state is a little lost. Uh, there are some things, monetary policy, which is clearly the union government, and there is mosquito control, which is clearly at a city government. We will talk about villages in a moment. What is optimally placed at the state level is extremely limited, and this is going to require major changes in the architecture of the Indian state. There are a couple of ways to get to this. At the end, let's talk more about how to approach this problem. But I totally agree with your first order proposition that what is the state doing in all this? That really there is Bombay and there is a union government. I mean, who needs a state government? So the cities are all important, and there is a case for a union government which will do some foreign policy and some defense and some monetary policy. And for the rest, everything important happens at the level of the city. At the village level, there is a different problem, and this is the problem that the village does not have the minimum economies of scale. So, if you think of a village as about 150 households, about 600 people, in those 600 people, you don't have the minimum critical mass for how many civil servants will you have, how many politicians will you have, and there's not enough competition and check and balance to make a village government work better. So the maladies of a government are synonymous with concentration of power. So whenever you say a government misbehaves, it's because power is concentrated, and villages are subscale in terms of addressing those problems. There is no good answer to these questions. So I'm not a romantic about village level government. The research papers are a bit lukewarm about the gains from decentralization to village level governments. The gains are weak, they're not great. And again, this connects a bit to the architecture about states we'll come back to at the end. So I think that in India, in this debate, there has been a problem, which is that we've got the 73rd and 74th amendments of the Constitution, and we have thought about local government of a city and local government of a village as something that happens together and are much like each other. And I think that it is better to think about them as two different problems. There is really very different puzzles in making a village government work, and there is room for skepticism and there is room for gloom, saying if you have 600 people, it's more difficult to get a lot done, and maybe there are some other approaches that should be brought to bear. But with the cities, there is no question that, just like we would have statistics for the size of Indian states vis-a-vis countries of the world, the size of Indian cities vis-a-vis countries of the world, there are more people in Bombay, defined with a little bit of New Bombay, as compared to the population of Australia.
I think I vaguely remember that when Iceland did well in a previous football World Cup or Euro or whatever, I did the calculation and found out that the population of Iceland is equal to Warsaw.
Yeah, some 300,000 or
Yeah.
something, and half of them are fishermen.
Iceland or Warsaw?
Iceland.
Alright.
Actually, there are few fishermen
Warsaw,
in
there are
Warsaw.
lesser, but yeah, we have fishermen too, and we are proud of them. Continue.
Yeah. So, what is the role of the state is a confused mess, and we'll come back to that at the end. What is the role of the village is actually a messy problem, and in decentralization discussions, we do wrong by equating the city and the village. There is a city problem where you can be on the highway to greater decentralization. it has the minimum economies of scale to construct a public health department and go conquer the mosquitoes. Whereas in a village, there are a different set of problems. They don't have the minimum economies of scale, and the simple recipe is not necessarily the right one. And in India, the intuitive assumption that the 73rd and the 74th amendments of the Constitution go hand in hand and are much like each other is, in my opinion, a source of why things have not worked so well.
So I want to now step back a bit and ask a question about how things are before we talk about how they should be. Because, we often use these terms, you and I, 73rd Amendment, 74th Amendment, as if, yeah, we know what they are and all of that. But many of the gentle readers may not have familiarized themselves with either our history or our structure. So I have a couple of questions here. And one is that tell me about how it plays out financially. Like Pranay Kotasane has this great newsletter post where he talks about the fable of the monkey and the two cats. Are you aware of the fable?
Nope.
So the fable of the monkey and the two cats is like
So in
this.
this episode, we've got a dog, a cat, a monkey. Very nice. Keep going.
We'll keep going. And tanks, many tanks. So two cats are fighting because there is a piece of bread under the table. No, we are not going to pan down because there's no bread under this table, but there's a table. Imagine a table. There is bread under it. Two cats discover it simultaneously and they are fighting. And both of them want the bread. And so it's getting a little ugly. So there's a wise old monkey sitting on a train, or a canny old monkey sitting on a tree, not a train. Train kahan se aa gaya? So then the monkey, we just woke up a while back. So as you can see from my hair, so monkey bhai comes round and he says to the cats, "I will mediate. I will solve your problem. What we will do is you give me the piece of bread. I will make equal pieces for you because I'm a disinterested party, and then the problem is solved." So the cats say, "Okay." And mistake one. So they give the bread to the monkey, and the monkey breaks the bread, but one half is slightly more than the other half. So he says, "This half is slightly more, it's not fair, let me make it even." So he eats a bit of the larger half, but he eats a bit too much. Now the other one, the other half is bigger. So then he says, "No, I got to make it even," and he eats a bit of that. And he keeps doing this till there are only two little small bits left which are equal. And he says, "All right, so now we have two equal parts, but hey, I put in so much labor doing this, I need to be paid for my efforts." And he takes those and he goes away. Right? So this is a fable. And Pranay's point here is that what you see when it comes to how funds are given, in this country, we worry too much about horizontal devolution, he says, where, two states will be fighting with each other that Goa ko kyun diya, ya TN ko itna kyun diya, mujhe do, mera population ye hai, etc., etc. But we don't talk enough about vertical devolution, which is how much of the funds are actually going to the states, which is a critical component of decentralization. Because what is happening right now is that the South is complaining that, hey, we are taxed more relative to the northern states, we contribute more, but you're only giving 42% to the states, and then you can do the sort of horizontal arguments. In fact, in the 13th Finance Commission, Vijay Kelkar, your co-author, he was heading the 13th Finance Commission and made the suggestion कि states को दो ही मत, direct cities को दो. Figure out a way that funds go from the center to the cities, which is a different issue. So I want to ask two things. Structurally, tell me how it works in terms of the finances and how that arrangement is and the pros and cons, and give me a sense of how people have thought about this and tried to reform this with the two amendments you mentioned, and perhaps even the 13th Finance Commission. I mean, obviously there have been thinkers thinking about this stuff, trying to do stuff. So give me a historical outlook.
You've just woken up. You are fasting. I promise to make it worse.
Carry on.
Okay, so in the Constitution of India, there is a concept of a union list, a concurrent list, and a state list. All the imaginable subjects of government are placed into these three lists. Okay, the union list is that which is exclusive prerogative of the union. So the parliament has the power to legislate on things that are in the union list. The state list is where things are exclusively the domain of the states. Okay, and the concurrent list is a fantasy where the wise, capable chief minister of Maharashtra is supposed to be in a conversation with Jawaharlal Nehru, and they will find a middle road in a collaborative way. This is the kind of intuition that was there in the minds of the framers. Unfortunately, The devil is in the fine print. And in the fine print, once the union chooses to legislate on the concurrent list, they got it. So there is no negotiation. So for all practical purposes, the concurrent list is the union's. And so there is a very vast amount of territory that the union sits on. Okay? But governments and bureaucratic formations are never content. So the men of system at the time of the early years of the Planning Commission were not content with this constitutional scheme. They were not content to have the union list and the concurrent list under their control. They started eyeing the state list. Okay, they wanted the complete control of the entire Indian state to be run out of New Delhi with the Planning Commission determining everything. So they invented a concept that they would abuse the tax sharing mechanism. Okay, so the way it works is that the two dominant taxes are income tax and GST, and these are national taxes. Okay, your income is truly national, it's hard to attribute to a location. GST is very much attributable to a location, but it is easier to build a nationwide collection mechanism and later on to attribute what part of the GST is attributable to a state or a city, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So the big flows of money, the income tax and the GST, I'm glossing over many other things. So for example, there are customs duties, but you know, as a country grows up, you remove all customs duties, you remove all protectionism. So I'm just going to treat that as legacy and it's going to go away. In the main, there is an income tax and there is a GST, and there is an income tax on individuals, there is an income tax on companies. These are pots of money that go into the hands of the union government. So the first step is supposed to be that the union government appoints a technical group which is called the Finance Commission. Okay, a new Finance Commission has just got up and running. It has Arvind Panagaria as the chairman. Our friend Niranjan Rajadhyaksh was one of the members, but he couldn't quite make it. And then our friend Manoj Panda has replaced him in the Finance Commission. Okay, so this is the Finance Commission. These are technical, neutral, non-partisan bodies that have been created since independence. They are coded into the Constitution of India. So there was a Rangarajan Finance Commission, I think the 12th Finance Commission, there was a Kelkar Finance Commission, like that. So there's a long history of very respected finance commissions. And what these finance commissions do is they look at the union list and the concurrent list and the state list, and they form a objective determination of how much money should be spent where, and they advise the government on the proportion of the overall sharing pool of taxes that should go down to the state level. Okay, so this is the machinery that is supposed to be in place, but the folks in the union government were not satisfied with that. So what they started doing was like this: they would take money from the union pool, and the union was getting a lot of money from the Finance Commission process, and they would invent a program. So for example, they would invent a education program, and then they would offer it to the states saying, you know, I know education is your subject, but if you run education my way, I'll pay for it, or I'll pay part of it. So for example, today there are union schemes where the union offers to pay 65%. Okay, so they say to the state government, if you want to go your own way, you go your own way. You can go your own way. Okay, but if you go my way, then I'll pay 65%, you will pay 35%. And this is a very insidious form of control, because effectively you have hijacked the state's resources, you have grabbed their 35s, and you have imposed a design upon the state, and then so you are back to the great centralizing influence. Okay, so architecturally, I think all this is not on the right track. I think there should be no centrally sponsored schemes. That's what these things are called.
In fact, I have a great episode with Pranay Kotasane, I think 7 years ago, where he made the same argument. Yeah. So seen and the unseen.
Yeah, so I think there should be no centrally sponsored schemes, and I think the union should vacate the concurrent list. Okay, that is the path to genuine decentralization. But then you get to the problem of the state and the city and the village. Okay, in the old design of the Constitution of India, there was just a union and the states, that's all. Okay, and this is really closer to the vision of the Government of India Act of 1935. It is remarkable how much a plagiarism test would pick up things in the Constitution of India that come from the Government of India Act. Much later, there was a greater understanding about the importance of decentralization. When Rajiv Gandhi was Prime Minister, there was a remarkable moment where the INC was politically so strong that they could amend the constitution. And at that time, many people, most importantly Manishankar Iyer, led the thought that the Indian constitution needs to be amended in favor of a more decentralized vision of government. And thus was introduced the 73rd and the 74th amendments, which builds a city government and a state and a village government. Okay. Unfortunately, in my opinion, this did not remotely go far enough. So as an example, a logical extension would be to have a union list and have a state list and have a city list. Okay. And I think by the 80s, it was time to wake up and say that the concurrent list isn't working. So we should just cut the pretense of a collaborative agreement between the union and the states on the concurrent list. And we should have had a union list and a state list and a city list, but that was not done. Similarly, there needed to be far more clarity about the resourcing of cities. What was done was that the constitution imagines that there will be a State Finance Commission, SFC, okay, which is a little version of the Finance Commission. And supposedly a lot of the principles are to go through, where it is supposed to be a neutral body, it is supposed to be an independent body, it is not supposed to be beholden or allied to either union or states. Okay, these are what good finance commissions look like, and unfortunately these good features are only in norms and not in laws. So there is always the possibility of a finance commission being set up in ways that are cravenly in favor of the union government, because it is the union government that establishes the finance commission. Well, all these problems about the fairness and neutrality of the finance commission are what bedevil the state finance commission. Things are so bad in India, there are many states that are in violation of the constitution and they practically never bother setting up a state finance commission. But when they do, there is low technical capability, they don't have the data sets, they don't have the technical teams, and there is not even a pretense of neutrality. So the sharing that happens between a Maharashtra and a Bombay is really, extremely unfair, and it has not been done correctly. And these are all the limitations of the 73rd and the 74th amendment. Now, one big change in the taxation environment which happened later, and so which was not known to the authors of the 73rd and the 74th amendment. A very important thing that has happened is the GST. The GST is new in that it is clearly attributable where the transaction took place. Okay, so when I go and buy a mobile phone from a shop, there is a clear attribution about the location where the consumption event took place, and that is the location of the shop. So you can attribute the location of the shop to a state and to a city. Okay, and in the thinking work that happened on the GST, Dr. Govind Rao and others had worked on this earlier, and then Vijay Kelkar, Arvind Modi and I built a detailed blueprint of the GST as part of the FRBM implementation task force that was set up by Jaswant Singh in 2003. In that, we visibly could visualize that there is a city as a subnational unit of government, and there is full attributability of every expenditure event to a city. And so there can be a GST slicing that is not just union and state. So imagine hypothetically there is a GST design of a 5% GST for the union and a 5% GST for the state. Okay, this is the sort of thing we had in mind when we were working on the GST. Many things have happened after that, and India has landed up with a bad GST system, one of the world's bad GST systems, but don't get me started ranting on that. Let's stick with the original dream of a single rate GST of about 5 at the union and 5 at the states. Now that could equally have been cut up as, perhaps 3 at the union and 2 at the state and 5 at the city. Okay, it was it is entirely feasible today. So the GST is an important moment where there can be a first class tax revenue pathway that goes to the city and is immune to the institutional problems of the fair play of the finance commission at the level of the union and a finance commission at the level of the state. And currently cities are often like sitting as a supplicant at the end of two groups, and we hope that the two groups will each be fair and sound, and that may or may not be the case. There is a lot of interest in also developing a revenue base at the city through property tax, and that is good and appropriate. I am all for a property tax that takes place at the city, but the revenue potential is relatively limited. You can't get large amounts of money out of a property tax. So GST for the city is critical. So this is my long-winded explanation. That's a summary of the constitutional arrangement and the financing that can go to states and cities.
So before we get to the next chapter and my next question, I have three things to say. First of them is I must thank you from the bottom of my heart from assuming that I am as stupid as I am, because when you said the words mobile phone, you picked up your mobile phone to show me that, Amit, this is what it looks like. So now I know, and I feel so good that I have gained new knowledge today and I know what a mobile phone looks like. No, I'm just kidding. I'm pulling your most excellent leg. The other two things I want to point out both have to deal with our mutual friend Shruti Rajgopalan. Again, you mentioned amendment, having the numbers to make put an amendment through, and there is a must-watch talk for you, gentle listener, which we will link from the show notes, and you see it here, where Shruti Rajgopalan, where Shruti talks about the ways in which the constitution has been amended through the years from Nehru onwards. And Nehru started this practice that every time he wanted to do something unconstitutional, he would amend the constitution and make it constitutional, which is a cunning trick, and therefore the courts can't bother you. And this happened so much that there is an early cartoon which shows a reader going to the Parliament bookshop and saying, "Can I have a copy of the Constitution, please?" And the Parliament bookshop says, "I'm sorry, we don't stock periodicals." Right? So just kind of brings that aspect out. And the final sort of Shruti plug, she and I once did an episode on urban governance many years ago, so it's a short episode, again linked from the show notes, where she pointed out, and it's something I hadn't thought about, that if you are in Bombay today or any other Indian city, the governance is going to be bad because power and accountability are not linked. The people you have power over, they can't actually do anything, the municipal elections and whatever. And, the people who actually can do shit, they're not accountable to you because they're running at the level of a state government, their vote bank is elsewhere. And, there's sort of a fundamental mismatch there. So, Ajay Shah, I should tell gentle readers that there are two Ajay Shahs I know. And one is a serious, analytical mind, a man of history who will give you context and so on and so forth, as you have just seen. The other is a heretic who thinks mad ideas, and all of those mad ideas make sense. So I am now going to protest at the sober side of you, which we have seen in this episode so far. And I'm going to demand that the heretic present himself. So what's the sort of new thinking that you've done on this subject?
The first thing I want to talk about is migration. This is not very new, it's a little bit new. I'm basically integrating knowledge from other places and experiences. In the United States, a dominant idea in federalism is the role of migration. So in United States thinking on federalism, the idea is that if you don't like the life that you have in your city or in your state, then you will up and move. Okay, and migration is a powerful tool for people to exit. So if you think of the great Hirschman book, Exit, Voice and Loyalty, in India we are used to either loyalty or a little bit of voice. But in America they have emphasized exit, that you don't like your city government, you don't like your state government, move. Okay, and this does two different things. One is that there can be aggregations of like-minded people coming together with different preferences. So maybe, some people are more socially conservative, maybe some people are more socially progressive. Very well, sort yourselves. You will have a self-organizing system where certain states and certain cities will be more progressive and people will like to go live there who have those values. And maybe there will be some places where you get a life straight out of 1400 AD and people will go live there within the limitations of constitutionalism as is envisaged in the modern world. So you can't quite go back to the barbarism of 1400 or 400, but you can become more conservative or less conservative. Okay, so this is one aspect. But the moving has very interesting implications, and this has critically to do with the tax base. The moving can reshape the finances of the city and the state. Okay, and so if you are in an Indian style environment where a lot of the tax money goes up to the union and is captured by the union doesn't care where you are because they'll tax you anyway. Whereas if there is parts of your tax money that are going to the state and to the city, then moving is material, because wherever the person goes, the tax income goes to the relevant state. And here I want to link to ideas on the state from James C. Scott, where he has emphasized that in early states, land was not the problem. You didn't compete for territory. Early states did not compete for land. Early states competed for people. What you wanted is people to oppress. Okay, and when a government works badly, when a city works badly, when a state works badly, when a country works badly, the people will leave. And from this worldview, I celebrate the vast scale of migration flows that are taking place in India. Okay, there is a luxury belief in India where rich people sitting in their air-conditioned rooms like to bemoan migration, that, oh, it was so bad, this person had to leave their paradise in a village and they have come to live in a slum in a city. And I just think that that is completely wrong. People choose, and life in most urban slums is better than life in most villages, and if it wasn't, people wouldn't migrate. So there is no compulsion in the picture. These are voluntary choices, and I rejoice and applaud the guts of the people who migrate. And I think migration can be a great solution for a whole bunch of problems. Okay, so if you think of the Ambedkar view of the bigotry and the bad things that happen in a village, well, one very important solution is to leave, and I would encourage everybody to leave. Okay, the best thing for a woman in UP and other bigoted places of the north is to migrate to the south. Okay, things like that. So migration is a great lever, migration is a great tool, and regardless of what people like us think, individuals are choosing, individuals are moving, and people are moving across states, and people are moving across the border of the country. So as an example, think of the vast scale of people from Afghanistan or Syria or North Africa who are relocating into Europe. Okay, this is a market-based mechanism whereby the people are choosing better governments. Okay, that if a state does not do well, its people will leave, and the government in Afghanistan has fewer and fewer people to oppress, because every year the people are leaving. And ultimately what matters is people, not territory. That you can have many square kilometers of land in the Sahara Desert, that doesn't do you any good. What matters is people. And migration processes, moving across countries, moving across states, are a meritocratic mechanism by which the people seek out the better governments. So there is a reason why all over India there are people relocating to the better states of India. So all over North India, the dream of an ambitious young person is, you're a teenager, you want to attend college, you want to become an engineering graduate, and then once you have your engineering degree, what do? You migrate. You go to Ahmedabad, you go to Bombay, you go to Pune, you go to Hyderabad, you go to Bangalore, you go to Madras. Okay, these are all the lands of engineering jobs, and that's a great arrangement. So my heretical idea is that we should rejoice in migration and not be sad about it, and that migration is a meritocratic response through which the people of India are dealing with the heterogeneous levels of capability of the various governance units of India, be it a city or a state.
You just said people are moving. I was moving a lot because this bee was buzzing around my head. It seems to have fallen in love with me. And while my charms are undoubted, I would, not welcome this particular attention. But hopefully, it seems to have sort of reduced its buzzing. But so, what I really love
What was
about.
the name of the first episode of Everything is Everything?
I've forgotten, what was it?
Halfway to coal, halfway to diamonds. Halfway to coal, halfway from diamond.
Yeah. All right.
That's a
Okay.
line in a song. What's the line that appears before it?
Kindly explain.
Dragonflies are busy buzzing me.
Dragonflies are busy buzzing me. It's got such a lovely sonorous sound to it. So what excites me most about federalism and American federalism in particular is that it has a built-in notion of competition, right? And that is an incentive. States have to compete for people and revenues, and if people leave, they lose revenues. If people come, they gain revenues. They are always in competition with each other across different margins. The incentives are wonderful. They are trying to make lives better for the people, and perhaps some wise small states might even be trying to build certain niches which, for people who don't feel at home in other states. And that whole process of competition playing out leads to what I think of as a virtuous cycle. Everyone's better off, everybody's competing equally. My sort of skepticism about the migration in India is that I think the migration is awesome. But I think the incentive is not so strong because the states aren't so empowered, because their incentives are not so strong, because that tax money anyway, only a tiny chunk of it is coming to them. It doesn't really matter so much. It goes to the center, a little bit of it is devolved back. There is obviously some incentive that you don't just want everyone to keep going all the time, but it's not so strong as in America, for example, where it is almost an existential thing and everybody's competing.
So let's do 2-3 things. Even under the Indian arrangement of today, today's Finance Commission and the present design of the Indian state, it is true that for each one additional migrant into Kerala, a little more money goes into the city government that the person chooses to adopt and the state government of Kerala. Now, we would like to make these gradients stronger. We'd like to make these incentives better. And I think that a slice of GST going down to the state level is a very important part of the answer. So, Kelkar and I have long advocated something like this, that a single rate GST of about 10%, and we should think of numbers like 3 to 5, that a union needs about 3, the state doesn't have too much work, it needs about 2, and the city needs about 5. And at that point, you've got a long-term funding mechanism for the city, and then it's the meritocratic approach that a city will try to attract migrants, because the more business transactions that happen inside the city, they get a slice of the GST on that tax base. So it's a brilliant arrangement to reshape the gradient, but there is a weak gradient right away. Now, I want to put this in a bigger context, and that context is population change. Okay, so we have an EIE episode on population, where at the end I was saying that there is a dramatic problem of a demographic transition taking place in India, and there are parts of India which are like in China territory in terms of a very weak process of having births. Now, for them again, migration is key, because otherwise you have all the economic consequences of the demographic decline. So this is the best of all worlds for many states in India, and I think these are all internally consistent, that what happens is social and cultural and economic development gives you families that have fewer children, okay, and that in and of itself is a big problem. And the way to offset that is migration, and then you will suck in people from the bad parts of India. Okay, so this is a grand story that is playing out in India, and it has big implications for this discussion of heterogeneity and decentralization. I worry a lot about concentration of power in the subnational government. Okay, so let's take 2 steps back. The entire story of India, growth, development, the trajectory of the Republic of India is about becoming a genuine republic, about becoming a proper democracy. And what is a republic? A republic is a place where there is dispersion of power, where there is no one person that commands the power, where there is a dispersion of power. You have an executive and a legislative and a judicial branch. These are co-equal branches of government, and they check and balance each other. They often have conflicts with each other, which is very healthy, because that is how each of them is held in place, and power is dispersed. And this is an aspirational thing when we talk about the union government. We are not there. Okay, so as you know, Vijay Kelkar and I wrote a book on the subject, In Service of the Republic, and in summary, we say we will claim that the modern theory of economic growth, the modern theory of development, is at heart about this problem. It is about dispersion of power. It is about becoming a republic. If you get the checks and balances, if you get a sensible republic, then the economic growth will inevitably follow. Okay, that all the failures of India, the problems of India being a poor country, of weak growth in India, come from the concentration of power and the excessive overbearing union government that has tried to interfere in the lives of the people. Okay, now everything that we may think about dispersion of power and check and balance is equally true at the state and the city levels. You want a republic. You don't want an autocratic mayor who gets arbitrary power, is able to do anything that she wants. Okay, so we equally need that dispersion and that check and balance. And my concern is that a chief minister in India is a little bit of a dictator. Chief ministers in India have extreme power. They have very little check and balance. There is really no meaningful check and balance from a legislature, even like the way a Rajya Sabha works to make it more difficult for a ruling party to get a law across. It forces more negotiation around a law. That happens less at the level of a state government. The ruling party is very often able to just push through any law that they like. So then the law is just a perfunctory process. The state judiciary is very often cowed and fearful of the executive and will go along with the executive. And state chief ministers have very high levels of power. So I think this is where the romantic notion of decentralization collides with reality. That the problem with simplistic pushing on decentralization in India is that the subnational political system is a poor place to hold authority. So like we are presented a choice between bad and bad. Okay, you concentrate power in the union government, then things will go badly at the level of a city, because those union civil servants don't know what is happening in a city, and the frontline civil servants are not accountable. There is no check and balance. When you go towards decentralization, you get more check and balance, because those civil servants, the politicians, are embedded in the community. Okay, the civil servants in Nagpur live in Nagpur. The politicians of Nagpur city live in Nagpur. They speak to their friends and neighbors and their family, and that creates feedback loops of accountability. But the political structures of the Indian state, either at a state government or a city government, unfortunately cater to extremes of power. So these are the considerations, and I think that every advocate of decentralization, as we are, needs to also speak up and apply their mind on how we can improve the basic working of the republic at the level of a state or a city. Then how do you create dispersion of power? How do you create more check and balance? How do you not have one autocratic tyrant at the level of a state? And there I want to say that I have often read people in India writing about how nice it will be to delegate more power to state governments, and unfortunately some of them are quite happy and comfortable with a state chief minister as a dictator. So there is a very undemocratic and sort of low knowledge of political science in the hands of people in India who say, oh, union government, too much check and balance. The way out of check and balance is do things at a state government. And I would just say that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so wherever you put concentrated power, whether it is in a city government or a state government, it will result in trouble. And so alongside the whole larger journey of decentralization, we need a state level political reform and a city level political reform. And there's just not enough people thinking and worrying about this in India.
That's a brilliant cautionary point, and what I especially like is it shows the dangers of shallow thinking. Like, too often, what happens is we'll take up a mantra, decentralization, how it's good, but beyond that, we won't think deeper. Like, what I think we need to do is we need to begin with first principles, and then you'll arrive at decentralization. Like, why is decentralization good? But if you stick to the first principles and if you look at the data, then you'll realize that, okay, the state isn't enough. You got to think about this much more deeply, kind of like how you're doing. So, Ajay, this is most depressing. This is a situation we are in. What's the way forward? How do we solve this?
So many ideas here are important and need to be done. So for example, a slice of the GST going to the city, then a decoupling in our minds of city government from village government. They're two different problems. They need to be approached separately. Then the political system development at a city and at a state so as to achieve a republic, to have dispersion of power, to have more check and balance. All these things are required. One big piece that is required is that every government, every state, I'm using the state as in government, every state requires a commensurate intellectual community. You need the data sets, the thinkers, the research papers, the public debate, the criticism. Without that, no government ever works well. Otherwise, it's just pure political games that, once you strip out the knowledge, it becomes a raw power project, and that's not very interesting or useful, and it doesn't get good things done. So if you take decentralization seriously, we're going to need to develop a knowledge community at the level of each state and each city. My friends in Janagraha argue that there are many groups of cities which actually are sufficiently similar, sort of like a homogeneous regions argument. There is a group of homogeneous cities who are much like each other. So for example, reasonable people will agree that Bombay, New Bombay, Thana, okay, are really one group, and you don't need to have separate data sets and researchers. You just need to broaden your footprint of the research. It shouldn't be the perimeter of the island of Bombay. Okay, so the folks in Janagraha argue that there are 63 groups of cities in India, and around each of these 63 groups of cities, can you create some amount of shared capabilities? It could be data sets, it could be researchers, it could be research organizations, it could be some amount of shared services, doing a variety of municipal things. So these are important ways in which to go. Adding to all this, the most important change that I think needs to happen in India is that the states need to become smaller and many cities need to become states. Okay, so like you take West Bengal, it would make a lot of sense to maybe have West Bengal as 2 states or 3 states, one of which is Calcutta. Okay, Calcutta is so vast and so complex. It needs to be a first class state, and that also fits in the Indian constitutional scheme of the Finance Commission.
I have names for the 3 states:
But
Calcutta, West, and Bengal. Sorry, continue.
Yeah. So the state of Calcutta would be a first class player negotiating at the Finance Commission level and getting intergovernmental fiscal transfer directly. So there's one more advantage, that is you can get a slice of the GST to Calcutta and also money directly from the Finance Commission into Calcutta, and these are both things that can and should be done. So my thumb rule for India is we should be 100 states. Okay, and many of the states should be cities, and that would really improve a lot of things. Then each state can work with the present constitutional scheme of a chief minister and direct elections and legislature and the Finance Commission, because otherwise you have to go do a bigger amendment of the constitution. And we are in an environment in India where it is very dangerous touching the constitution. The drafting capabilities are poor. Okay, you don't have the kind of genius that was there in the Constituent Assembly back in 1947. So constitutional amendments are fraught with difficulty. To the extent one can incrementally refashion the present words from the Constitution, it's a safer direction to go. So Amit, we're at the end of this fascinating episode. What are your book recommendations for today?
So a couple of the books I would naturally have wanted to recommend, I think we've already recommended before. There's A Power Broker by Robert Caro, and there is Triumph of the City by Ed Laser. But I want to recommend, and I might have recommended this before also, but it's an absolute masterpiece, The Death and Life of Great American Cities by Jane Jacobs. And she's our kind of thinker. She's like, cities evolve bottom up. You need organic growth. You need to respect that. Cities are people more than anything else, not just buildings and highways. And this is like a fundamental philosophical difference with Robert Moses, who is a main character in Cairo's The Power Broker. And, they fought a lot about this. So, The Death and Life of Great American Cities is a must read. Jacobs, for me, is one of the great thinkers of the 20th century. We should all read her. And again, all of us who live in cities literally have skin in the game. So please read Jane Jacobs, is my plea. And what about you? What's your recommendation?
I'm going to reveal a great secret to you, gentle reader. That I'm going to recommend a book that is not yet released. Okay, Bimal Patel is a preeminent urban thinker in India. He is a dreamer about town planning. He gets town planning in a way that essentially nobody in India does. And I shall reveal his secret that he's building a book. And when that book comes out, you should run, not walk, and you should read that book.
I love the way you combines unexpected verbs and nouns. Like in the previous episode, you said solving a mountain, and over here you're like building a book. And Bimal, by the way, I mean I must endorse that. Just one of the great thinkers of modern India. And we've been talking for 3 years about him coming on the show. He wants to come. I want to do it, but we just haven't managed to make the logistics work. Perhaps when his book is closer to ready. But one of the great thinkers, and every time I speak to him, my mind just like explodes in different ways. Just a great thinker. Yeah, and on that note, yeah, decentralization. Let's do it. Ajay in a tank.